Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really fascinating topic, a huge sweep of European prehistory.
We are. We're looking at roughly 35,000 years ago, right up to about 4,000 years ago, focusing on the steppe invasions.
And we're doing this through a specific lens, aren't we? The shape of skulls.
Exactly. Cranial morphology, basically.
hmm
How the form of skulls changed over these, millennia.
It's based on a massive amount of research.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Archaeological, anthropological studies. We're drawing on data from over 3,900 male skulls.
Wow. So the idea is to kind of use these skull shapes to get a feel for the big picture. Migrations, cultures.
That's the plan. To pull out the really important insights, understand those major shifts, maybe even touch on genetics, but, without getting bogged down in overly technical stuff.
Sounds great. A clear, engaging look. Okay, so where do we start? The very beginning.
Let's jump into the early Upper Paleolithic. We're talking roughly 35,100 to about 25,900 Cal BC.
So what's the general picture for skulls back then?
Well, the general tendency is towards robust skulls, broad faces, quite strong-looking features.
Okay. But the evidence is a bit limited, right?
It is. We only have, I think, 8 really complete male skulls out of 26 studied from that specific time frame.
But even with those few, can we see any patterns?
Yeah, interestingly, their shape, their morphology, it's actually closer to the late Upper Paleolithic skulls than you might think,
Oh, right.
but quite different from, say, Holocene populations, the much later groups.
Gotcha. So some continuity early on, but then changes later. Are there any specific examples that really stand out from this early period?
Definitely. Kostenki 14 is a key one. It's the oldest skull in this analysis, about 35,000 years old, found in Ukraine.
And what's special about it?
It's strikingly small overall. Features like a low nose height, but a wide nasal opening, and a bit of prognathism. That's where the jaw juts forward slightly.
Okay.
What's really fascinating is that despite being the most ancient and quite distinct from recent Europeans, it shows some, unexpected similarities to later skulls found in Greece.
Greece. That is unexpected. Thousands of years and miles apart.
Exactly. It hints at maybe very early, complex population dynamics we don't fully understand yet.
And then there's this distinction I've read about, the Cro-Magnon type versus the Brno type.
Ah, yes. Within the Aurignacian and Grevetian cultures of this period, we see these two kind of general forms.
How different do they look? Can you sort of picture them?
You can. The Cro-Magnon type, like the famous Cro-Magnon 1 skull, tends to look a bit rougher, more rugged features, maybe stronger brow ridges, that kind of thing.
Okay, robust.
Whereas the Brno type, exemplified by Fred Mosty 3, seems more, let's say, harmonious, balanced.
Right.
The Brno skulls also tend to have a higher upper face, taller eye sockets, and the overall skull shape leans towards being taller and narrower.
So like different builds almost, even way back then. And size is a factor too. Some were quite large.
Very much so. Some of those Grevetian skulls, like Barmagrand 5 or Grotte des Enfants 4 and Fred Musty 3 again, they are notably large.
And that connects to their height.
It seems to, yeah. There's evidence suggesting some of these individuals were exceptionally tall. Grotte des Enfants 4 might have been around 194 centimeters.
That's huge. Over 6'4". Incredible for the Paleolithic.
It really is.
Now, genetics comes into play here too, doesn't it? With the Forinal and Vestonis clusters.
Yes, paleogenetics has identified these two major ancestral clusters in early Upper Paleolithic Europeans.
And is there a neat link? Like Forinal equals Cro-Magnon type, Vestonis equals Brno.
Well, that's the hypothesis people have put forward. The idea is the more robust Cro-Magnon form might link to the Forinal cluster, more common in the West, and the more gracile Brno type to the Bekanas cluster, more Central East Churn.
Right.
But honestly, the evidence is still limited. We just don't have enough well-preserved skulls clearly associated with genetic data from that specific time to confirm it definitively. It's suggestive, but not proven.
Okay, a tantalizing possibility for future research. Let's move forward in time then to the late Upper Paleolithic. This is what, 17,000 to 9,500 BC after the Big Freeze?
Exactly. This period follows the last glacial maximum. And yes, it was a tough time. The climate was harsh.
So people had to adapt, move around.
They did. Populations retreated into refugial areas, places like southwestern Europe, Italy, the Balkans, parts of Eastern Europe where conditions were slightly better.
And that stress shows up in the bones.
It does. We see signs of poorer health, nutritional deficiencies.
Yes.
Average height actually seems to decrease a bit during this period.
Interesting. Smaller stature, but what about robustness?
Paradoxically, perhaps, There's a tendency towards greater skeletal robustness overall, maybe a response to the tough physical demands.
Hmm. And how did this affect the skulls? What do they look like?
Well, we have data from 22 male skulls. About 12 are fairly complete, plus a separate sample from Italy. There's some variation.
Yeah, they stand out.
The Magdalenian skull, Chancellor 1, is a bit of an outlier. It's quite tall and narrow, contrasts with another, Laugerie Basse 4, though that one's incomplete.
Okay. But more typical examples.
Skulls like Willebrunner 1 and Oberkassel 1 are probably more representative of the general late UP morphology.
So comparing them to the early UP folks we just talked about, what are the main differences?
Generally, the late UP crania are a bit smaller overall, which kind of fits with that decrease in body size.
Right.
We also see a narrowing of the forehead, and the face, relatively speaking, seems a bit larger compared to the brain case.
Facial changes, too.
Yeah, specifically the eye sockets tend to get taller, the nasal breadth reduces so the nose looks narrower, and the orbits, the eye sockets, become relatively narrower too.
Okay, some definite shifts in facial architecture there. And how do these late UP skulls stack up against even later populations? Closer than the early UP ones?
Yes, generally they show more similarity to the Holocene samples, the post-Ice Age populations, than the early UP skulls did.
Any specific groups they resemble?
Particularly some of the Neolithic groups from Eastern Europe,
Right.
like the Athanasio culture.
Right.
And here's another odd one. They show a surprising closeness to the Ibero-Mauritian population from North Africa.
Really? Despite no known close genetic link?
Exactly. It's a morphological similarity that's hard to explain genetically, at least with current data. Convergent evolution, maybe, or some ancient link we haven't found.
Fascinating. And what about the Near East, the Natufians?
Ah, they're quite different. The Natufians from the Levant have fundamentally different features. Taller, more V-shaped faces, narrower across the cheekbones, but broader foreheads. Very distinct.
Okay, clear differences there. So the ice retreats, the climate warms up. We enter the Mesolithic and early Neolithic, roughly 9,500 to 6,000 BC.
That's right, the beginning of the Holocene. And things start changing again. Agriculture is just appearing in some places.
What's the source space like for this period?
It's better. We have 9 regional samples plus a large summary sample covering the European Mesolithic.
And genetically, what's happening? Hunter-gatherers are still dominant.
Yes, but we see 2 main groups. The Willebrunner cluster, mostly in Western Europe, and the Eastern Hunter-Gatherer, or EHG, cluster in the East.
And they meet and mix.
They do, especially in those contact zones. Morphologically, though, most of these Mesolithic groups look different from their Upper Paleolithic predecessors.
Different how? What are the trends in skull shape?
Generally, there's a tendency towards skulls becoming relatively taller and narrower compared to the late UP.
Taller and narrower.
And also an increase in the relative breadth of the forehead, what we call the zygofrontal index.
Okay. Does size vary much?
Yes, and cranial size differences might relate to body size. For instance, some of the East European EHG groups were quite tall, and they seem to have correspondingly larger skulls.
Makes sense. But as always, there are exceptions.
Always. Olenij Ostrov, for example, in Karelia. Their skulls are large, similar in size to early UP groups, but their shape is more like late UP.
A mix of traits.
And then you have the Mouge Valley sample from Portugal. They stand out.
Oh, so?
They're more grantal, more lightly built, with these V-shaped faces that actually resemble some Near Eastern populations.
Really? Like the Natufians?
Not exactly the same, but leaning that way. Their skulls are notably narrower and a bit lower, with narrower foreheads and cheekbones compared to other Mesolithic groups, even those of similar estimated height. It suggests maybe some different influence or ancestry there, perhaps from the south or east.
Interesting. Okay, now we hit a really major transition, 6,000 to 4,000 BC. This is when farming really arrives from Anatolia, right?
Yes, a pivotal moment. These Anatolian agriculturalists start moving into Europe.
How do they spread?
2 main routes, generally. One up the Danube River Valley into Central Europe, and another along the northern Mediterranean coast.
And they met the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who were already there.
Absolutely, and they mixed. Genetically, we see this blend of Anatolian farmer ancestry and the local European hunter-gatherer lineages.
And something else was happening in the East around the same time.
Right. At roughly the same time, you have another group, genetically related to Caucasus hunter-gatherers, the CHG cluster, moving from the Caucasus region into the Don-Volga area of Eastern Europe.
And they mixed with
the Eastern hunter-gatherers, the EHG, who are there. So you have these waves of newcomers mixing with established populations.
What happened to the original hunter-gatherers?
They were increasingly pushed towards the peripheries, northern Scandinavia, the Atlantic fringe, dense forests.
Okay. So big population movements, genetic mixing.
Yeah.
What did this do to skull shapes? Were the newcomers different?
Very different. There's a really striking morphological contrast between the Neolithic populations in Eastern Europe and the incoming Anatolian farmers,
In what way?
primarily in size.
Yeah.
Take the Neoperdonic culture. In Eastern Europe, they had these huge, very rugged skulls reflecting a really robust physique overall.
Wow. And the Anatolian farmers.
Much more gracile. Smaller skulls, generally consistent with their smaller body size. We see this clearly in places like early Neolithic Greece.
To a stark contrast, East Europeans staying large and rugged, Anatolians smaller and more gracile.
Pretty much. Although, interestingly, both groups tended to have relatively tall cranial vaults. But the East Europeans kept those large, broad faces, linking them back to the older UP and Mesolithic types. The Anatolian Neolithic skulls, though, had this distinct V-shaped face, receding cheekbones, narrower eye sockets, and a higher upper facial height. Quite a different look.
And what about cultures that were a mix, like Smolensk on the Volga?
Smolensk is interesting. Genetically, they're a mix of EHG and CHG. Morphologically, they deviate a bit from other East European groups.
How?
They're actually closer in some ways to the Neolithic Europeans with Anatolian roots, smaller overall size, for example, though with a broad face. But they also have this really unusual trait, ultradolichocephaly,
Meaning?
extremely long and narrow heads. Very distinctive.
Got it. And we should quickly mention the Khitaj culture, too. Way over by Lake Baikal.
Yes. Important context. The Khitaj skulls are short-headed, brachycephalic, and show what anthropologists classify as mongoloid features. They're thought to be linked to the ancestors of Uralic speakers, very different from the European groups we're discussing.
Right. Okay, moving into the next millennium, 4000 to 3000 BC. Farming is spreading to the last hunter-gatherer areas.
Exactly. Places like the British Isles, Scandinavia, the descendants of those Anatolian farmers are colonizing these regions.
Did their skulls change over time, these farmer populations?
Yes, there's a trend. Compared to the earliest Neolithic farmers, the skulls from this later period tend to become relatively lower, wider, shorter, and just generally a bit smaller.
Interesting. And back on the Eastern European steppes, what's brewing there?
That process of mixing between the EHG and the incoming CHG groups continues. This is the period where the Jamnaja culture starts to crystallize out of the earlier Sredni-Stog culture.
Do we have good skull data from the steppe itself for this specific time?
It's actually a bit limited for this particular millennium, the 4000, 3000 BC window on the steppe proper.
But we have related groups nearby, like Majkop.
Right. The Majkop culture, north of the Caucasus. They were genetically pretty diverse. Their skull size is large, linking them to the East European EHG-CHG groups, but their shape is kind of intermediate between the typical Near Eastern and East European forms.
And Usitovo, over near Romania.
Usitova seems to be a blend, probably steppe populations mixing with the local Kukiteni tripolors,
Yeah?
and their skulls reflect that morphologically somewhere between the two.
Okay. And south of the Caucasus.
You have the Kura-Araxes culture. They're primarily CHG ancestry, and their skulls fit well within the general Near Eastern range of variation.
All right, further east, Turkmenistan, Namazgar.
Mazga descends mainly from CHG, though there's later EHG admixture. They develop a really distinct shape. Very narrow, and again, ultradolichocephalic, extremely long-headed, plus a long, narrow face.
Lots of variation. What about hunter-gatherer descendants still around, like the Volosovo culture?
Volosovo and the Upper Volga forests were mainly EHG. In analysis, they cluster somewhat near Upper Paleolithic Europeans due to their large cranial breadth.
So retaining ancient features.
In some ways, yes. But their overall shape is quite different from most Holocene groups. Shorter skulls, high upper faces, long noses, high orbits. Intriguingly, they show some morphological pulls towards East Asian samples.
And Zvidnieki in the Baltics.
The Zvedjenki sample, by the Middle and Late Neolithic, actually shows a shift back towards Upper Paleolithic morphology, which fits the genetic picture of strong EHG continuity or resurgence there.
Fascinating how dynamic it all is. Okay, now the big one. 3000 to 2000 BC. The Bronze Age begins, and the Jamnaja expansion.
Yes, this is a period of massive upheaval. Pastoralist groups associated with the Jamnaja culture expand out from the Pontic-Caspian steppe.
And this had a huge impact on the existing population.
Huge. It led to a major decline of the Neolithic farmer populations across much of Europe. Disease might have played a big role, things like plague.
And genetically, who were the Jamnaja?
Roughly an equal mix of the Eastern hunter-gatherer, EHG, and Caucasus hunter-gatherer, CHG ancestry, as we mentioned. They likely spoke early Indo-European languages.
And the expansion was mainly male-driven.
The genetic evidence strongly suggests that yes, a lot of male-biased admixture, leading to big social and genetic shifts, founder events.
Right. So what did these influential Jamnad people look like, skull-wise?
Their genetic signature is mirrored in related cultures like Afanasevo in the east, Poltavka, Katakomnaja. Morphologically, they are characterized by large skulls and, importantly, wide, bizygomatic, breadth-wide cheekbones.
Okay. Large and broad-faced, different from earlier steppe groups.
Yes, they tend to have relatively shorter skulls and lower, wider vaults compared to, say, Smolensk. They actually show some similarities back to the Sredny Stog culture and even some Upper Paleolithic EHG groups.
Was there variation within Jamnaja itself?
Yes, some. For example, Jamnaja samples from Ukraine tend to be more long-headed and high-headed, while those from Kalmykia, further east, lean towards brachycephally shorter, broader heads.
Interesting. And this period sees the rise of two other major cultures linked to the steppe, corded ware and bell beaker.
Exactly. And crucially, they represent two very distinct, almost antagonistic morphological types, even though both derive significant ancestry from the steppe, and both show an increase in average body height.
Okay, let's take corded ware first.
Corded ware arises from a mix of Genejar-related steppe groups with Neolithic farmers in Eastern Europe and also some local hunter-gatherer admixture. Morphologically, they develop this very extreme shape.
Which is?
Ultradolichocephalic, super long and narrow skulls, but with relatively wide foreheads. This type appears quite rapidly and spreads widely, suggesting a strong founder effect. The closest analogy is actually among the long-headed Jamnaja groups in Ukraine.
So extremely long and narrow heads. What about bell beaker?
Bell beaker also has Jamnaja-derived ancestry, but generally with more admixture from Anatolian-related Neolithic farmers. They also show signs of a strong founder event.
And their skull shape.
Almost the opposite of corded ware. They are characterized by short, broad, and rather flattened skulls, brachycephalic, high cephalic index. They tend to have narrower foreheads than corded ware and smaller faces with less protruding cheekbones.
Wow, so two groups, both with steppe roots, but ending up with dramatically different head shapes.
Exactly. It was quite remarkable. There's some regional variation, of course. Central European bell beakers show influence from local Neolithic and corded ware groups. And interestingly, bell beaker skulls from Britain resemble some earlier finds from Belgium, hinting this broader-headed type might have already existed in some Northwest European farming groups before the main beaker expansion.
And we should briefly mention pitted ware.
Yes, in Scandinavia, they seem to represent the genetic and likely morphological survival of the earlier Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, the Villebrunna cluster descendants.
Okay, lots happening. Let's just quickly touch on some non-European comparisons from this time.
Sure. Tepe-Hisar III in Iran, linked to CHG ancestry, shows a small, low, narrow, long shape, somewhat similar to Namazga. And the Okunev culture in Siberia is a fascinating mix of ancient North Eurasian and Siberian ancestry, showing some Mongoloid characteristics.
Right, useful context. Okay, finally, let's pull back. How do all these ancient skulls, Neolithic farmers, steppe invaders, corded ware, bell beakers, compare to Europeans from more recent history, say the 17th to 19th centuries?
It's actually quite different. The typical skull shape from those recent centuries is pretty distinct from most of the Neolithic and Bronze Age populations we've been discussing.
How so?
Recent European skulls tend to be shorter overall, but taller and broader, more brachycephalic or mesocephalic on average, with narrower foreheads and noses, and generally smaller faces.
So not like the big, rugged steppe skulls?
No, not really. And generally not like the extremely long-headed corded ware type either.
Is there any overlap? Any ancient groups that resemble more?
There's some partial overlap. They come closest perhaps to the bell beaker range, and also some North European and Mediterranean groups that fall within the range of the earlier Anatolian farmers.
Okay. But it's important to remember when those recent samples are from, right?
Absolutely. Those 17th, 19th century samples largely represent a period near the peak of brachycephalization, the trend towards broader heads in many European populations. They might not fully represent the genetic potential under different, perhaps better living conditions.
And that trend has reversed recently.
Yes, there's been a well-documented trend of debrachycephalization skulls becoming relatively longer and narrower again during the 20th century.
So where might that be heading?
Well, it's led to some speculation. Could modern North Europeans, maybe like Norwegians today, be heading back towards the kind of extreme long-headedness, the ultradolichocephaly we saw in the corded ware culture?
Really? Is there evidence for that?
It's speculative, but not entirely unfounded. Skeletal samples from earlier periods like the Roman Age or early medieval times often show lower cephalic indices, longer heads, than those 17th, 19th century samples. So the recent trend might be returning towards an older pattern.
Fascinating. So if we try to sum up this whole journey, what are the big takeaways?
I think you see this initial long period through the Paleolithic of relatively stable, robust morphology. Then, the arrival of Anatolian farmers brings increased diversity, a new, more gracile form, alongside the existing hunter-gatherer types.
And then the steppe invasions really shake things up.
Dramatically, they introduce not just new genes and culture, but lead to the emergence of entirely new, quite distinct skull shapes. The super long-headed corded ware and the broad-headed bell beaker types is a major transformation.
It really highlights the complexity, doesn't it? Skulls tell a story, but it's alongside genetics, archaeology.
Exactly. It's one valuable line of evidence. And it throws up surprises, those unexpected similarities between distant groups, or times when skull shapes didn't change dramatically despite major cultural shifts like the initial Neolithic transition in some areas.
Yeah. This deep dive definitely shows how much is still being uncovered. What are the big questions that remain based on this kind of cranial research?
Well, integrating the rapidly growing paleogenetic data with these morphological studies is absolutely key. That's where the exciting frontiers are.
Specific puzzles.
Pinpointing the exact origins and developmental pathways of the bell beaker morphology is still debated. Why did that specific shape arise and spread? And understanding the rapid emergence and success of the corded ware type. What drove that? Was it purely genetic drift and founder effects, or selection too? Exploring that interplay of genes, environment, culture. That's a challenge.
It certainly is. And it really makes you think, we've seen these huge shifts over millennia. How might our own lifestyles, our environment today and in the future, continue to shape human physical form?
That's the provocative thought, isn't it? What stories will skulls tell thousands of years from now about us? It's a continuous process.
A fascinating question to leave our listeners with. Thank you. This has been an incredible journey through time using skulls as our guide.
My pleasure. It's a complex but rewarding subject.